Okay, so let's talk about Production Planner Workbench. You see there that I only had half my face here because the other half was short. It was on a late PO and they couldn't expedite it because it was coming over the ocean on a crater. So do what you can. Let's talk about job shortages. This is an issue that I find in manufacturing environments is really predominant and just a painstaking, crippling affliction for a lot of manufacturing environments. So let's talk first about when I'm talking about a shortage, I'm not referring to like a sales order stock out. Different situation, similarly problematic, but has different dynamics. With job shortages, I'm really talking about the ability to supply material to support manufacturing. So your manufacturing activities have your bills of materials, the ability to get those materials marshaled and presented in front of manufacturing with sufficient time such that they can make those products and produce them as needed. So this could be a couple of different things. It could be manufactured components themselves. All right, so you have subcomponents that are being constructed that are going to get absorbed by higher level assemblies, either through as a subassembly or a make direct job, or just issued from inventory. And it could be a raw material, or it could be component materials. It could be purchase components. It could be something that's complex in and of itself. The key here is having it available such that that higher level assembly can be made on schedule. Now, the inability of being able to do that, and I think anybody who's working in manufacturing is pretty familiar with those challenges in terms of the impacts. This would be haphazard scheduling techniques, which are pretty common, is that you're doing a lot of one-off scheduling changes in order to address what you can make. Shop inefficiencies, that's pretty common. You have the pick it up, put down syndrome, you might call it, right? Where you're not making things as well as you'd like because you can only make it in part of it, and then you have to put it down, pick it back up. Inventory behaviors. It's interesting how shop shortages makes inventory management worse. You might think that poor inventory management techniques lead to shortages, and they do. The inability to keep accurate inventory often is a cause of shortages. But also, when you have shortages, you can quite often create the problem itself and make it worse at an inventory management level. I knew one customer, they would literally, when they had a shortage, they were willing to take out the wrenches and literally disassemble one product and take a component off of that product in order to put it on another product that was of a higher priority. So you can imagine what that does to your inventory. Did those changes get caught up in the system, or did they just make the move and go? So now you have a job where you issued the material and the job doesn't actually have it. And then you have another job where you manually, physically put that component towards that job, but did it happen in the system? That creates all kinds of confusion across the shop floor. And really all the challenges that come with half-finished product. Now, so I come from a manufacturing background, and I come from an environment where it was very common that you had crates and pallets of half-finished products stuck in the corners. And this causes a number of problems, really. It can be causing damage, it can be causing injury, or it can be causing loss. You could be losing that product. You'd be surprised how many times I've run into customers who had product that was partially manufactured, put somewhere, and then we don't know where it went. And who knows what happened. Maybe someone disassembled it for another job. That's possible. Maybe they just put it somewhere where they forgot to look, and we find it when we're doing cycle counting or year of end inventory. And it's funny because the injury portion is actually something that I would take seriously myself, because I even have nicked up my shins a number of times in the factory due to stumbling over product that really shouldn't have been in that location. And that's because factories aren't designed to store half-finished product. We have a place to put finished goods. We have a place to put our raw materials, but where to put a completed a half assembled product, oh boy, that's a much more difficult when you're running through. It can't stay in the work center because the work center has its own product flowing through, so you have to stick it somewhere, and wherever you're putting it generally turns that area into a safety hazard. So I think that it's pretty self-evident that managing shortages is a really helpful and important thing to be able to do. So then we get to the question of, well, what are the types of shortages that you might run into in a normal manufacturing environment? And here I see kind of two different types. And I think the kind that you see here are anticipatory shortages. That's kind of the first type. And this is a projected shortage, something that you see out into the future. So for those of you who are already working inside of Epicor and are familiar with time phase is your friend for identifying when those shortages start to occur. You watch the required quantities and the received quantities, and you see how those slowly work. And as the required quantities exceed what you have on the received side, be it on hand inventory or new supply coming in, you see that things start to run negative. And now you realize, okay, I have a shortage situation for those jobs where that negative exists. And now you start asking yourself, what do I need to do in order to satisfy that demand and get those products available to the shop before we actually start manufacturing? That becomes kind of your key question. Now, if you are further out into the schedule and you're within lead time, then you're great. If you're not within that, okay, now you need to do things to proactively address that. So that might mean changing manufacturing schedules, changing purchasing schedules. It might mean that you open up capacity by reducing the job quantities of some jobs, right? Products that you're making into inventory, let's say you're making a quantity of 50 into inventory, but that's because it's economic order quantity, it's economic run quantity. Well, you pull that down to 25 to open up some capacity so some high priority items can fit into that space and support your finished goods. Or you might find ways from a purchasing standpoint to try to expedite things. This might be adding expedite fees, extra shipping fees, or what have you, to try and get that product in-house earlier. Now, I know with a lot of the purchasing environments that I interact with, that's a real challenge because a lot of goods have significant and pretty fixed lead times. There's no way of expediting something that's coming over the ocean, right? So those challenges naturally build themselves. And so you try to anticipate shortages as much as possible and as soon as possible and leverage Epicor with its time-phased logic through PO suggestions and MRP and what have you, so that you can see that those things before they start biting you. Now, speaking of biting, you get to the point of reactionary shortages. Now, this case is much more, I think, what we think of when we think of a shortage is that's a shortage that's discovered after, I call it anyways, I say after the job is released. So this is a very Epicor-centric thought in my mind of, if I use that release status of a job as a real kind of critical line in the sand between what you do to anticipate and what you do to react. So most often it's occurring when materials are being pulled and issued and you realize, oh, rats, we don't have this part available. What do we need to do? And what we need to do normally involves some form of rush action in order to hit your due dates. So you are scrambling with vendors, or you are scrambling with your employees to try to reorganize their work, or people are working overtime. You're doing some form of reaction to try and block up that shortage. And kind of to that point, this is kind of a fundamental business decision that companies need to make when they're setting up and running an ERP system. And this has to do with the idea of material scheduling. Now, how are you scheduling your materials vis-a-vis the jobs in which they reside? And I've kind of basically, in my mind, I can think of two fundamental strategies, and that might affect the way that you are managing these upstream. And the first I call is the manufacturing gate. Now, I came from an engineer to order environment where we had implemented Bond 4, great system, and it allowed you to link up materials to different operations to do some form of MRP's approximation of just-in-time scheduling. We'll talk about that in a minute. But we got to a lot of cases where we would start jobs without any confidence that all the materials were available to complete that job. And then you would, not surprisingly, run into a point where you had a bunch of half-finished materials. They may have already started assembly, but now you had to put all that on the side because one of those lined up materials did not come in on time. And so what we changed our process through re-engineering activity. Remember that term? That's a fun one. So we re-engineered the corporation and we reorganized our manufacturing so that everything went up to what we call the manufacturing gate. And in that situation, nothing went into manufacturing that did not have all of its necessary materials available. So if you didn't have this component or that component, well, it was going to stay and wait. And the people in front of the gate, the engineers, the purchasing and planning people, they were doing all the scrambling up front, such that you try to avoid the scrambling downstream. So that's the idea of the manufacturing gate. The other model, and I'm going to call it just in time, and this is maybe a little for you lean purists out there, this might be a faux pas, but I'm trying to get across the idea that the material is scheduled to arrive just when it's needed. So if the material is needed at operation 20, okay, in my example here, you can see material 20 and material 30 are required to support operation 20. So those are scheduled accordingly. If operation 10 takes 3 days, well, at the end of those 3 days is the date in which these two materials are required. Similarly, material 40 is not required until operation 30. So you schedule those dates out further such that it gives you more lead time from a supply side, and that supply people always like that amount of lead time. And it gives you more of that to be able to slip that in before it's needed. Now, the challenge, of course, is you get down to operation 10 and 20, and you get to 30, and you're asking yourself, oh boy, do I have material 40 available? So those are two very different strategies you can employ in how you want to line up your materials in order to make sure that you are successfully executing in manufacturing. So with that in mind, enter the Production Planner Workbench. And so this is one of Epicor's kind of out-of-the-box standard base module tools, no extra licensing required, just comes with the basic standard production module, but it's probably one of the lesser used in my mind. And I think there's a lot of value to it in some contexts, and specifically in the context of shortage management. So what is the Production Planner Workbench? And it's kind of two things, all right? So it's a process-based tool used to assist in identifying material shortage. It's time-phased, so the shortages that are identified are identified according to the order that those jobs will require the material. So according to how time phase is saying, okay, this job gets in first, then this one, based on dates and needs, these jobs are consuming those materials, and it's making that same assumption there. So based on how you set up your schedule, it's looking and making assessments accordingly. So really can be helpful and used with scheduling and planning. So it's a natural tool for that proactive shortage management, that kind of expediting that you're doing before you've released work to the floor. And it also helps with the releasing of work to the floor. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So with that in mind, just what's so important about releasing jobs? Okay, so I've been in a lot of environments that treat releasing jobs very differently. Some companies that I've worked with, as soon as the job's created, it's released. They want it as simple as possible, just a kind of a rubber stamp, and it's there, and then manufacturing can do what they want with it. I've seen other companies that are kind of on the other side of the scale. They are very, very careful about what they release into manufacturing, and they'll have a big backlog of work behind them, but what gets through to production is very carefully managed based on capacity, tooling, customer priority, and material shortages. So the idea of released, all right, you have a number of statuses inside of a job that are really important to understand. Three that are very common: firm, engineered, and released. So firm means that the job is no longer being managed by MRP. So if you make a job through quick job entry, it's going to immediately be firm. If you make a job through the order job wizard, it's going to come through as firm right away. A job that's created by MRP, when it runs, is by default an unfirm job. That is a job that MRP will continue to monitor, manage. Every time it runs, it'll delete that job. If it's like a full regen, it'll delete that job and then recreate it as needed based on shifting demand. So the benefit of that whole MRP engine is it's taking care of all that nervousness in the schedule, wiping out the old and replacing it with the new. Engineered is really telling the system that this thing has a very consistent method of manufacturing and it's been fully defined. Consistent is probably a bad term, more fully defined and ready to be made. And then released, so release tells us that this has been released to production. So this means two really important things in an Epicor context. One, that you can issue materials against these jobs, and two, that you can track labor against them. So if you try to issue materials to an unreleased job, it'll stop you and say this job's not released. You can't do that yet. Or similarly, if you try to start production activity on a job, it will stop you because it says the job must be released. So I always recommend with companies, you want to be very careful when you are releasing jobs and do so judiciously in order to avoid a couple of things, shortages for one, and I would say a cluttered production schedule. There's a lot to be said for only putting the work in front of manufacturing that they need to execute in a given time and not bogging them down with more than they need. There are a lot of cases, I think, where you can create challenges for yourself if you are putting too much work in front of manufacturing. I remember this when I was on the factory and we were making parts and we were able to see way out into the schedule. So we looked 3 months out into the schedule and we made all the parts that were common across that schedule. And we felt real good for ourselves because we were really, really efficient. And then we found out later that a couple of those sales orders were canceled and all those parts we were made were scrap. All right. So I was very efficient at making scrap. And that's not what you want in a manufacturing environment. So a key to keeping some of those challenges from occurring is being very judicious in how you release those jobs to the shop floor. And so one of those keys to doing that is the idea of shortage management. So with that, we talk about the Production Planner Workbench and told you a little bit about what it is. But firstly, and this is something I get when we are consulting and we're bringing a customer onto Epicor for the first time. And we say to them, oh yeah, we're showing them all the tools in the toolbox essentially that they have to work with to perform job management, scheduling, and related activities. And we say, okay, this is the Production Planner Workbench, and this is the planning workbench, and the customer does a bit of a double take and says, excuse me? And then you have to describe to them why these two very different tools are named almost the same thing. Myself, I kid that if it wasn't for Epicor naming everything strangely, I wouldn't have a job. So it's my job to be able to tell people how they differ. So the Production Planner Workbench is a tool for understanding material shortages for jobs. If you're going to summarize it quickly, that's really what you're talking about. And it's very different than the planning workbench. Now, with our last summit, I had given a talk on the planning workbench. That's a tool used to define a couple of things, make to order demand, and a variety of manufacturing exception scenarios. So still a manufacturing tool, still used in planning, but very different in a very different context. Okay, you talked plenty. How about a demo already? So two key components of the production planning module in Epicor. One is running a background production planning process. So this is a process-based tool, kind of like MRP. It's something that needs to run on a schedule. So we'll start off with running on the process. Let me get out of here and jump into the production planner process. Okay, so this is the kinetic version. My slides all have the traditional version. I'm one of those consultants who's still so old school that he can barely get out of that old school 905 tree structure. Production planning process. Really important here when you're setting this up that you pick the settings that you want to use, because these settings will greatly affect how the process runs and what data it generates. So I'll really run through these quickly because I have another slide that speaks a little more thoroughly on it. So you can choose to include release jobs in managing your shortages. You can choose to ignore backflush materials. So if you have materials that are backflushed on a job, and we'll be covering that in a subsequent talk, you can ignore those. In a lot of cases, backflush materials are high volume materials that are low cost and very rarely short. So if that's something you're not interested in checking for, put that aside. That's what a lot of companies want to do. Ignore future receipts and requirements. So these are things where you ignore what you're looking at. If you're in a very tight mode, you only want to worry about what's in front of me. What do I have on hand and available? And I don't want to, this might go back to that whole material gate versus JIT. If I want to only know what's in front of me and what I have on hand that I can trust to be able to release something versus being able to look out into the future and say, okay, yeah, I know this PO is coming in, so I can trust that. This helps you get rid of those. Avoiding non-stock materials. That has to do with whether or not that part is something stocked or if it's going to be supplied directly through purchasing or directly through manufacturing. Current site, good thing to have. If you want to keep that thing running quickly, you can flag that. Expedite PO suggestions. Important if you want to avoid that optimism that comes from, oh yeah, we have a PO suggestion that's going to tell you to correct this PO. If you don't want to believe that, if you know those expedite suggestions aren't really going to be acted upon, you ignore them. You can also similarly ignore checking for materials for unfirmed jobs that are past due. So if you have late stuff in the schedule that's still getting plugged into there and you know you're not going to make it, but that just hasn't been mopped up for some reason, it'll ignore that. And then similar with planning contract links, that'll change the way that it looks, whether or not it includes planning contracts and trying to find where material has been pre-allocated for customers. I'll go ahead here. I've set just a couple of these in a demo environment here, and I'll kick that off, get a nice little message here telling me that the process was submitted. Okay, so that was a very short demo. More coming. But for now, so we talked about these. So we have a cutoff date. It's real important how far you want to look out and what you all want to include in terms of the jobs and their supply. Current site, we talked about that. Release jobs. Do you want to track shortages for release jobs? Again, this has to do with how closely you're managing that release date. If you're releasing very early in the process, well, you might want to see shortages on release jobs. If you're releasing very late in the process, probably not, because you're assuming that you're only releasing stuff that has no shortages. We've talked about backflushed. We've talked about receipts, so that we've covered pretty much these others. So one question that gets asked, when this process runs, what data gets generated? So now the data guy in me is going to geek out here a little bit about what tables underlying this tool get populated, because these can be really helpful if you're trying to create your own kinds of queries and tools and things, dashboards and the like, to try to pull in some of this additional information. So first is the production planning header. So basically this table holds all the jobs that are out there that may have material shortages. So it'll flag those at the top that says, okay, this job has material shortage. So this is a real nice quick view look. Kind of a child table to that is the production planner material table. So this holds information about all the materials for those jobs, and it flags which ones may have shortages. So very helpful now in kind of dissecting and understanding, you know, the wheat from the chaff, which ones actually have shortage problems here. And then the production plan quantity table is kind of a separate table here that's more of a summary table of all your parts that are shortages. So if this is helpful more in a manner of before you're worrying about releasing jobs. So releasing jobs is really about the header and the material there of which one materials are late and can I release this job into production. Whereas the quantity, that's more kind of even more proactive of, okay, you give this to your materials managers and now they're looking to ensure, why are these things short? Now, a lot of materials managers are doing this already. It's using time phase. They're going one part at a time and they're going through time phase and they're kind of sifting through. That can be very time consuming and a lot of effort. What I found in cases here where companies successfully use this, they're able to take that information here as this is your hit list and use this hit list now to do your work in time phase versus going through a much larger body of activity, kind of separating that wheat from the chaff. So to that note, I ran some of these different settings, all right, in different modes to see how it would affect both time and the number of records. These would be header records created. So if I'm just checking current site and everything else was checked, it only created 460 records. All right, because it didn't include a lot of things. As soon as I include release to jobs, this was just in a sample environment where I just wanted to use this for purposes. Including release jobs took longer, but it got me many more records. Now, if I ignored backflush materials, this trimmed that down. So now all those backflush material records got picked out because they didn't have issues. Now, as I move down to ignoring future receipts requirements, in this case, there were none available, so it didn't change anything. It took a little less time to run, but it didn't return anything different from in terms of the number of records. Now, as we get down to expedite PO suggestions, that trimmed it down a little bit further. As we ignored unfirmed jobs, that trimmed it a little bit further still. And as we ignored non-stock materials, again, those things all get out. The question in your company is, do you need to manage those things? Do you need to manage backflush materials? Is there a possibility that you'll have a shortage with backflush? Is there a possibility that you'll have shortage with non-stock? In many cases that happens. So you need to make those decisions carefully. So what is the logic that the production planning workbench is using? I've said again that it uses kind of a time phase logic. So let's assume you have a job. It has a due date of 3/22 or a start date of 3/22 and a due date of 3/24. It's a 2-operation job. All right. You have material tied to one operation. It's due 3/22. You have material tied to a second operation. It's due 3/23. And you have, say, a purchase order that's due that's supplying the first material, and you have a purchase order that's supplying the second. All right, so time phase, the production planning process is looking out and using that time phase based logic to say, okay, will this purchase order make it in time to supply this material? If this purchase order is coming in on the 24th, oh, we might have a problem. All right, so if I was an audience member right now and not myself, I would be asking, this is all great. Now let's go back to the demo and let's talk about that. So as we talked about the 2 phases, there's the process and there's the workbench. Let's go ahead and talk about utilizing that workbench. And to that end, let's talk about, I have some jobs that I've created here that I've used for this demo purpose. Let me move. So I have a number of jobs that I created. And they're all for basically the same part, except I've messed around with the materials just a little bit. All right. So job 2436, very simple job, 3 operations, 1 material. You can see here, this doesn't have that little red dot. Now, sometimes Epicor gives you different information that tells you the same thing, but it tells you differently, which can be a problem. This red dot, this absence of a red dot here, of course, tells you that you have adequate on-hand inventory for this part. So you should be okay in handling. Okay, that's good to know. Let's go ahead and prove that out in time phase. Just move my job entry over here, and we'll take this material. We will open this with time phase. All right, so we see here, this is a very popular part in this training database. And if we get all the way down to near the end, we'll see, okay, we have a number of jobs that are looking for this, including our own job. So this part had a significant on-hand quantity. And by the time this job comes along, we needed 2.5 feet of this specific material for this job. And as we see, there's adequate on-hand inventory to satisfy that. So we can anticipate that there'll be no shortage on that. We look at another job, 2437. Okay, I went and added a couple of different materials this time. And you can see here, this has the red dot. So we can anticipate that this has no on-hand inventory to supply this job. We look over in time phase, we'll see, yes, our on-hand inventory is nothing. All right. We have also, we'll note that we have a pending PO coming in, and it is due for 3/19. All right. And we see that the material requirements for this job 2437, those are needed on 3/22. Okay. So 3/9 coming in on 3/19, needed on 3/22. Excellent. That should be, if that tracks out as intended, that should satisfy that. Now the next part, another material, we come out, we look out into time phase for this material, and we see, okay, we have none on hand. We have a couple of jobs that have demand for it. All right. And we see that we have a PO coming in, but it's coming in for 331. So this is kind of the inverse scenario. Oh boy, we have less than we have stuff coming in, but it's coming in later than we will need it. So that could be a problem. And now I'll go to my final job, 2438. And we see again, we've added those two same materials and we've added a third. And in the case of the third, there is just the demand. We have no supply. So the purchasing hasn't purchased this part yet. So we have no incoming supply planned. So this looks like this could be a shortage as well. So let me close this out and let's open up the production planning workbench. Very good. All right, so the production planning workbench, it has a variety of tabs to it that help give more information on that data about a given job. And it has that information separated in those tables that I had talked about. So if we look at, we have a job section and a parts section. So in a parts section, it's separated according to shortage parts. So these are parts that have current shortages. And we will see that the two parts that we had talked about before, we had this one part, -02, was the part in which we had a PO coming in, but it wasn't coming in on time. And then we had this part 03, which was a part that had a shortage, but it had no supply at all coming in. Okay. Similarly, this gives you a view of all parts on hand, and it highlights the ones in yellow that have shortages. So depending on how you want to look at your data, if you want to look at, okay, I want to see all my material requirements over this time period according to what was run, and I can, come and have a look here, great. And now if I just want to look at my shortages, now I can focus on those. So that's the parts section. Now the job section has a little bit more information. You have this is really just a fancy dashboard essentially. It has a bunch of filters that you can apply so that you can filter these things down by things like the planner. That's always a good one. Part number, go straight to a description, where the description might contain something. I've seen a lot of customers also create a custom version of this, take the base, copy it, and then create a custom version that allows them to add more information, which can be very helpful, especially if you start to modify or copy and modify these queries that come from it. You can join them now with different tables and start filtering by make to order versus make to job versus make to stock, or filter according to inventory levels or product groups. That can be very helpful. So you look at this filter and it brings you three tabs. So one is jobs with shortages. All right, jobs with full availability, and then you have all jobs. So similarly, the system here will give you a look at all jobs. You can review all jobs and review their material availability and compare them with their shortages. So I'm going to look at the shortage jobs because these were the ones that I had set up for the purposes of our demo. And we'll look at 2437 first, and we'll see here, this is for that material. It has a required quantity of 2.5. It has an available quantity of none. So this obviously tells us that we need to go off and do something. So you might go and jump out of here and now try to open this with time phase and figure out, as a material planner, what's missing, what do I need to do to try to correct. We look at this next job, 2438, and it has two shortages. It has the shortage for that material that has the late PO, and it has the shortage for that material that hasn't been ordered at all. So again, this would be our opportunity now to take that and start looking for it. If you look at the tabs below, you can see what's available versus what's short for a job. You can look at all requirements for that job, and here it'll flag the shortage for you. It'll also help you understand what are the shortages for that part in general, because you might have more than one. You might have total shortages. So if you're saying, if I have X amount of shortage for that part, is there something else that I might want to worry about? Or all requirements. What are the requirements? Look for all of those parts. So then really, this is kind of your jumping off point if you're going to try and act in the system and do something to try to correct these. If you have that process running in the background, as soon as they're corrected, the next time the process runs, you'll find that this part no longer has a shortage. All right, so let me go back to, all right, so setting up, there we are. Let's talk about some of the key fields in the job itself that are kind of fundamental now to this data. Because really, I've seen a lot of customers say, hey, well, did you try the production planning tool? It never worked. It didn't give us accurate information. I say, okay, well, are your bombs accurate? No, our bombs are terrible. Oh, is your inventory accurate? No, our inventory is awful. Are you purchasing lead times? What lead times? So you just start to discover that the inability to use a tool is quite often fundamental to the data that's underlying it. And when I find companies struggling with a lot of shortages, struggling to get jobs successfully through manufacturing with a lot of hiccups, it's a matter of data being incorrectly set at various points. Okay, so let's start here with the job, and we'll just talk through a couple of the keys. So when you talk about a part, this material is a material against this job. It is related to an operation. Very important, because that operation will define when that part is needed. So the operation you choose is really important. The backflush flag, this tells you whether or not this thing is going to be automatically issued when you complete quantities. Very important. And it's also very important that it's not conflicting with other settings, and we'll get to that. The quantity per parent and the required quantity fields are very important, because the quantity per parent tells you how much for a given unit of the parent you'll need. So to make one of the parents, I need 20 or 0.25 feet of this specific material. It's really important that those are accurate, because if you're not accurate, and if the job is actually consuming more, you're always going to be short, in principle, or else you'll have to have some kind of tremendous buffer stock to compensate, which could be a problem. Similarly, the make direct and the purchase direct flags are very important, because they'll define how that part gets supplied. Is this thing getting supplied through inventory? Is it going to come through the warehouse, or is it going to be supplied directly? Are we going to create a purchase order to go out and buy that thing, or are we going to create another job to buy that thing? Now, there's some complexities there. These things give you a great sense of line of sight and tunnel vision to your specific needs, but that comes at a cost. When those products get completed and received into the job, they go into WIP. So their traceability is not necessarily as obvious as when they were in inventory. Inventory, the Epicor does a much better job of managing and displaying inventory quantities than it does WIP quantities. And that can be a challenge for a lot of customers, because they bought this material and they received it in. Now they can't find it. All right, because it didn't actually truly get consumed by the job right away, because the job didn't get started physically yet. So now you have to put it somewhere. And so you put it up in a rack, but it's not in the rack in the same sense that a inventory part is in the rack. So that can create some confusion. So you have to be a little careful there. Now, there's also one very important field, that is the required by date. And it's not actually in the main detail tab, it should be, but you can get it in the grid view. So it's important to know that that's the date that TimePhase is now going to use when it calculates its needs and drive to that. And now, when we talk about the job, you really can't talk about the job unless you're also talking about the parts. All right, and there are a couple of things I was thinking about in preparation for this, about things I've seen customers do that are kind of challenging in terms of trying to supply product correctly. One has to do with the non-stock flag. So if you're taking a non-stock product, you're saying, I'm going to supply this directly. I'm going to purchase it direct. I'm going to make it direct. If it's on a sales order, I'm going to make to order. All right. If it's, or else I might buy to order if it's a purchase part. And I'm going to do that directly. I'm not going to pass through inventory. And then folks struggle with that visibility. They love the visibility before it's complete, right? Because you can always say, this job is getting supplied by this PO or this other job. That's great. But once the thing's complete, now where is that material? That location step becomes a challenge at times. Also, efficiencies can be a challenge. If you have a part that's non-stock, but you might want to make it in mass quantities, well, that really is kind of against MRP's logic. MRP says if it's in non-stock mode, I have kind of tunnel vision. I only care about this single demand. I don't care about any of the other demands. And then you'll find yourself doing manual steps to try to consolidate demand, using maybe job manager to group things, or job batching, or a variety of other activities to try to get demand collected into a single source of supply for efficiency's sake. And those things can have a lot of value, but they take some time and some effort to get working. So you have to be really judicious about that non-stock flag, because that flag will set the purchase direct or the make direct flags on the job. All right, and you want to try to avoid making ad hoc changes that get these out of sync, right? You want to try to be consistent with similar parts. If you have the same kind of part and some of them are make direct and some of them are purchase direct, that could create a lot of confusion internally. Looking at the purchase order suggestions flag, on the planning tab, there's the process MRP flag, which is about as important. So you want to figure out if this part is something that MRP is going to look over. I have some customers who do Kanban parts. All right, so Kanban, they're going to make a Kanban quantity, they're going to make it, they're going to put it into inventory, and it's there. And MRP is not going to try to track and aggregate and do any of that kind of work, which works well for people. But you want to make sure that if you're treating a part as a Kanban, that it's not also treated as a non-stock, because Kanban implies that that part is stocked. So I've seen customers who've had Kanban parts that are also non-stock, so then that confuses the system. So we want to avoid that. Similarly, non-stock and backflushed. Again, if it's backflushed, it's coming from inventory. So if you're going to backflush a part, it should be stocked. So those, I'd say, would be a couple of things when you're working through these from a supply side that can really help you make sure that you're supplying the product in a manner that you intend to. I've also seen some customers, they'll do a make direct materials, all right, because they like that link, but then instead of actually receiving to the job, they'll receive to inventory. All right, so because they want it in inventory so that they can locate it, but they made it from a job. Now the system confused beyond belief, and then they come to me and say, I'm frustrated because I made this to job, but now I put into inventory and it got robbed by another job. Well, yeah, that's the challenge of putting it into inventory. It would be much simpler if you put it into inventory, then use the fulfillment workbench to allocate to a job and make that kind of a direct link that way, kind of trying to leverage the standard system and not confusing it so much with mixed messages. All right, so last slide, a couple of questions to ask yourself when you're thinking about job management, scheduling, and shortage management. All right. First thing, when you're doing this, how optimistic do you want to be when anticipating shortages? So you'll see those check boxes when you run that process. Most of those are all talking about some form of optimism, pessimism. Can you be optimistic that your backflush materials will never be short? Can you be optimistic that the purchasing agents will be able to act on change suggestions? Can you be optimistic that your parts are going to come in on the day that they intended? Depending on your sense of optimism, and I don't want to conflate with pessimism, your sense of reality and what would the environment that you're in, you might want to configure that system differently to give you different results. I have some folks who don't want to know what future inventory is. They just want to know what's in front of them, because they're good. They have a very tight timeline from the time they release to the time they start work. So they really don't care about what might come in. They just want to know, what do I have in front of me? So kind of related to that, what is your methodology for approaching materials before job release? And it's my contention that the more gymnastics you're willing to do before you release the job, the fewer problems you're going to have after. And I think that with the customers that I've worked with that have taken that approach, they've been happy with the results. Kind of looking back further, how soon do you want to actually firm jobs? So the idea there would be, the sooner you firm the job, the sooner that MRP doesn't care about it. Now, if you're in an engineer to order environment where you have a lot of changing methods of manufacture, that could be a real challenge. All right. And I've seen customers who have that environment where they firm way out to the future, And now they have to engineer those parts. Okay, now you have to come in, you need to delete the method maybe and get a new method from a new revision, or you need to make more surgical changes. That can be a lot of work versus just letting MRP do that heavy lifting. This goes back to the idea of released jobs. It makes it harder to release jobs if people have actually started transacting against them. That makes that much more difficult. Once a job has a material transaction, you can't delete them all. You can't delete all your mom and get details again. Similarly, if you have direct materials, purchase direct or make direct, and MRP starts creating make direct jobs and purchase order suggestions for that job, that'll stop you from deleting a mom. You say, yo, you can't delete this mom. It has a make direct job link. So now you got to find all those make direct jobs and delete those out before you can delete the job. So some of that, you pay for some of that make direct visibility that it gives you from source to target. How do you intend to handle reactive shortages? Real important there. I think there's a real sense of the companies that have the most discipline in handling the shortages that come up after releasing jobs have the best success at being keeping their inventory level and keeping their ship dates. And this all goes back to, again, how much of the heavy lifting do you want MRP to accomplish? I think the better you understand what MRP and that time phase logic can do for you, I think you're in a better place to really optimize the system. So with that in mind, I found my other half. It finally came in while we were waiting. So now I have a full me. And I'd like to thank you for your time, and I look forward to talking to you again. And if you have any questions, this would be a great time to cover them. I will turn this back over to Cindy.